and welcome back to There's Danger Here. I'm Leilani, and today I'm going to be bringing you an older case. I know that I've been doing a lot of nurses, I feel like, lately, but this is going to be another nurse case, so bear with me. All right, let's get into it, shall we? Honora Kelley was born on March 31st in either 1854 or 1857. Based on the sources that I could find, the bulk of them do say 1857, so that's kind of what I've been going with. In Boston, Massachusetts, to Irish immigrants, Peter Kelley and Bridget Finn. She was the youngest of three girls. The eldest was Ellen, who went by Nellie, born in 1850, and the middle daughter, Delia, was born in 1852. Her parents were hardworking, and when Nora was first born, Peter worked doing piecemeal work, so making garments, and Bridget worked in the laundry facilities. They made enough to live in an apartment with 2 bedrooms, nothing bigger this time. The 2 older girls ended up in school, and little Nora stayed with her mother as she worked. Soon, however, Peter began drinking, and his work suffered as a result. The girl's mother, however, kept the family together, working even harder to make sure that they were cared for. That was until 1858, when Bridget got sick. She began coughing, she struggled to breathe, and Nora ended up helping hold her up as she continued to work through her sickness. Until eventually, Bridget died of consumption, now known as tuberculosis. After that, Nora was stuck at home with her father. Peter continued to work and drink, and for a time he managed to keep the family afloat. But afloat here means that the family struggled to be fed. Heat was non-existent in the winter, causing the girls to have to cuddle up with one another during those frigid months. And as a result, most of the girls were pretty frail, especially little Nora. One day, Nora supposedly heard a noise coming from her father's room while the older 2 were at school. She went into his room and found her father in the midst of a psychotic break. He was slowly stitching his own eyes shut, having completely done one of them and kind of in the middle of the second one before she entered. Nora screamed, and the result was pulling Peter out of this kind of state that he was in. Panicked, he attempted to pull out the stitches of his eyes, and they ended up getting a pair of scissors to cut them open so he could see. Peter immediately went to the hospital, and while there, he signed over his 2 youngest daughters to be cared for by the state. Nellie continued to stay with Peter to act as his caregiver, and after that, I could not find information anywhere on the pair of what happened to either Peter or Nellie. However, there were some sources that did say that Nellie herself ended up having a psychotic break later on. The 2 younger girls went to the Boston Female Asylum in February of 1863, which was essentially a state-run poorhouse for girls. There's little information about this time as well. However, looking back historically, poorhouses were not a very good place to be. There was one source that said that the girls were fed, but anything beyond that, essentially, they didn't get. It was just a bed and food. Other than that, multiple reports state that Nora remained in small stature and became a target for bullies within the poorhouse. There are a few sources that reported that Sister Delia started working in sex work in order to bring in money and create this nest egg of sorts in order to get the 2 sisters out of their situation that they were in. Unfortunately, at some point, it sounds like about a year in, the police were involved and the state ended up kicking out Delia from the house. Shortly after, Nora found that she was quote-unquote adopted to a family, basically to become an indentured servant. At the time, she was somewhere between 6 and 7 years old. Again, it varies based on when you think her birthday was. The Toppan family had a daughter, Elizabeth, who was around the same age as Nora, and according to sources, they reported that they wanted her to become her personal servant as the pair grew up together. The family was out of town when Nora was first brought in, and this allowed her to learn her role as a servant, which purportedly she did quite well. She didn't ask questions, she just completed her tasks, anything she was told, and she ended up learning very quickly. A couple days later, Elizabeth returned home, and the two girls did get along very well. So well that eventually Elizabeth and the other servants began teaching Nora school information. And as it turned out, Nora was exceedingly bright. She picked up on reading and writing quickly enough that she was given books within the family library to read for herself. She was taken to school with Elizabeth and brought to her tutoring sessions. It was around this time, in about 1865, that Elizabeth wanted Nora to be more like the family, and Nora's name was formally changed to Toppan, and her first name, in order to supposedly hide her Irish heritage, was changed to Jane, so she officially became Jane Toppan. From then on, Jane worked as a servant, but also remained close with Elizabeth. By the time Jane turned 18, the family gave her $50 as a nest egg, as her indentured servitude was over. $50 in about 1875 would have been worth about $1,468.40 in today's money. But still, Jane stayed with the family until she turned 25-ish. That was when Elizabeth got engaged, and it put a rift in the relationship. And after Elizabeth's moms passed away, Jane left the house. Jane then realized she needed to work, and options were limited at that time. In the late 1880s, she ended up in Cambridge Hospital and trained as a nurse. Once again, she was so quick at learning that she started picking up information that the new doctors were also learning. She would read through their textbooks, eventually allowed to sit in on surgeries and autopsies, learning pretty much anything and everything she could about the human body. According to multiple reports that I could find, she knew so much that many of those junior doctors would actually lean on her for advice, even though she was still technically in her own nursing school. They trusted her judgment and she even began performing minor surgeries for the doctors, ones that would be typically like in clinic today. Her coworkers loved her as well, and her demeanor earned her the nickname, quote, Jolly Jane, end quote. In the background, however, there was a more sinister Jane beginning to evolve. While she was apt at taking care of the ill, she also began experimenting with their medication. And I don't mean she was using the medication, I mean she was using it on her patients. So, in particular, morphine and atropine. Finding that certain doses of atropine, the effects were not what was to be expected and not what was ordered for. So, atropine works by blocking the effects of the neurotransmitter acetylcholine at muscarinic receptors, and this can help increase the heart rate by blocking the vagus nerve's action. Yet, as it turns out, microdoses can actually have the opposite effect. So, Jane would give certain patients low doses of atropine along with morphine, and that would induce effects that Jane then studied, watching until they eventually succumb to the experimentation or illness. And often these were wealthy class patients. Soon, it wasn't just about control. Jane found that she got sexual pleasure from torturing patients. In 1887, a woman named Amelia Finney started to wake up from an operation with Jane in bed, kissing all over her. When Amelia made a noise, Jane basically gave her more medication, and she was knocked out again. Amelia didn't tell anyone because she wasn't sure if this was real or kind of the result of anesthesia, and so she kept it to herself. In 1889, Jane finished her residency and moved on to Massachusetts General Hospital. There, the doctors weren't new or in training, and it took Jane a while to find ways to store or change dosing of medication in order to continue her experimentations at this point. For 2 years, she worked at the hospital, but in a place with seasoned staff, people began to take notice of her kind of strange affect, her above average number of patients that were dying in her care, and the amount of time that she was spending in the mortuary. It was around the 2-year mark that, after rumors of mishandlings had continued about Jane, that an autopsy was performed on one of the unexpected deaths under her care. The result was proof that they had an excessive amount of morphine in their system, which had caused their death. But this is the time where hospitals didn't want to admit to any wrongdoings. They were there to save face. So instead of outing the mistake, they quietly let Jane go without actually giving a reason for termination. So that made her eligible for hire at any other hospital at this point. So, as such, in 1889, Jane managed to immediately return to the hospital where she completed her residency, Cambridge, and she was welcome back by all accounts. Everybody was so excited to see this woman, and for months she did well. But in her new and comfortable self, red flags really came about pretty quickly. And again, it was noted that she had this odd behavior with her patients and that she was spending so much time in the mortuary. And later it would be revealed that one of the many times that she'd go down to the mortuary, it was often to see her patients, the ones that she had experimented on and killed essentially. Her victims began to be killed closer and closer as well, until two were in such short succession that they too caught on to the potential of medication mishandling. And once again, after autopsies were performed on these patients, Jane was again let go. Jane shifted easily into her next role, however, of private nursing, though she never officially registered, and this is purportedly in order to keep kind of doctors from noticing her name and recalling her from the hospital and kind of keeping her out of trouble or in the background. She would enter the homes of elderly, well to do families and care for their ailing members. For a period of 5 years in the 1890s, Jane was active, killing family members pretty much as she pleased. She began drinking heavily at this time and spending the money that she had earned. And as a way to supplement that, and Jane always seems to want more, she also began stealing from her clients. Often, she would take small things that she believed wouldn't be noticed, or she would take something and make a client so sick that the family was bereft and didn't seem to notice the theft until Jane was already gone. Sure, rumors began circulating of a thieving nurse, but her other reputation managed to keep her fairly untainted, for a time anyway. In 1899, Jane received a letter from Elizabeth. Elizabeth had fallen into a depression and reached out to the only person that she considered her sister, asking if they could settle their past. Jane wrote back and said that she was in holiday near the Cape at Buzzards Bay and would be happy to meet up with Elizabeth. Unfortunately, during lunch, Jane laced Elizabeth's drink, and their reunion became the death of Elizabeth. Dutifully, Jane held Elizabeth as she died, and then returned with Elizabeth's body, holding her hand all the way home. Elizabeth's widower, Ormel Brigham, allowed Jane to stay for the funeral. As she was ready to leave, Ormel fell ill, unsurprisingly, and Jane stayed to take care of him. Shortly after he began to be on the mend, it was Jane who fell ill, needing care of her own. And Ormel felt that he simply couldn't just cast her out of this. And of course, Jane had planned these sicknesses, but it was in an attempt to convince Ormel that she was wife material. But as the months ticked on, he was not interested in her romantically, and Jane had to make herself feel better eventually to avoid suspicion. When she did, Ormel suggested she leave. Jane then attempted something off the wall. She said that she was pregnant and she was going to blackmail him. She said it was during an event that occurred while she was watching over him during his sickness. Periods of time he couldn't remember what was happening, and that she had stayed in his room all night, every night, to watch over him. But Ormel rebuffed the blackmail and kicked her out immediately, telling his servants and everybody what had happened. She moved to Bourne and stayed in a friend's cottage from there. As she wasn't working, however, she began to falter on payments. Maddie, had known Jane for a long time and went to visit her on July 4th, holiday weekend in 1901. The two seemed to get along the first day they were together, and they decided to meet up again the second day. And that was when Maddie brought up rent and the fact that she owed so much money to the family. Jane reported that she would be getting a new client soon. And during the conversation, no surprise, Maddie began to feel unwell. Jane started taking care of her in the cottage, and over the next few days, Maddie's condition continued to worsen. Jane notified the family that there was pretty much nothing that could be done except say goodbye and keep her comfortable. And so everyone except her husband, who was pretty significantly older than Maddie and in his own frail health condition, came down to be with her. A week after their encounter, Maddie was dead. Jane was brought back to the family home at the request of everyone who had seen her diligently caring for Maddie. Even after Maddie was buried, they insisted she stay. The patriarch of the family, again Captain Allen Davis, was an elderly man, like I said, and he needed tending to. Since they saw Jane do such a good job with Maddie, they thought that she could do it again. Jane immediately set to him, taking care of pretty much everything. An eldest daughter, Minnie, was constantly near Jane. She believed that Jane could get through the grief of losing her mother, or get her through the grief of losing her mother, excuse me. Instead, Minnie was found dead in bed on July 29th. 3 days after that, Captain Alden suffered a seizure, rendering him bedridden as well. Then he too passed away that evening. Grief took over everyone in the family. But one person, Edna Bannister, who was Alden's sister, managed to keep her wits about her for a time. She realized it was awfully suspicious for one person to come into their lives in such a short time and have this quick string of deaths in the family. She dug into Jane's past, but could only find rumors of sticky fingers. In fact, some of Jane's patients actually lived much longer than anyone had anticipated. Later again, it was revealed that she was the one stringing them along in order to stay in their house and basically live their lavish lifestyle. Edna invited Jane to tea to get a sense of things and found that she actually liked Jane. However, while she was talking with her servants, Jane dosed Edna's drink, killing her. And this left just Genevieve, the youngest daughter, all alone. Distraught, she too reached out to the only person that had been there during this chaotic period. After meeting with Jane, Genevieve asked for help getting through the grief, so Jane prescribed her some medications and gave her injections. After which, the last standing of the member of the family was dead. From the first murder in the family to the last, only 6 weeks had elapsed. Minnie's husband was now full of suspicions, asking Genevieve's husband to perform an autopsy. He knew something was wrong. But the family purportedly balked at the idea. They were just disgusted that they would do this. And so Minnie's husband did the only thing he could. He had his wife's body exhumed, for which he was shunned for a time. As she was raised from the earth, Jane took flight. And soon the family had to apologize for their heinous treatment of him. And that was because the coroner sent samples to Harvard University by Professor Edward S. Wood, an instructor at the Harvard Medical School, for analysis. There, lethal doses of morphine were identified to have been in Minnie's system. Finally, Genevieve's husband consented, and a second autopsy was performed with the same result. Morphine had been her cause of death as well. Jane was on the run until October 29th, 1901. It was at that time she was found working for another family, still as a live-in nurse, back in the Boston area. She was taken into custody without incident. And in custody, she didn't attempt to claim her innocence, but rather that she was not insane. For 6 months, Jane was held at the Barnstable County Jail while awaiting trial. And despite suffering from occasional bouts of anxiety and depression, Jane did pretty well. Though she still stuck to her idea that she was sane and she did not want to end up in an asylum. Jane admitted to the 5 murders within the Davis family that police were already aware of, and as she spoke with police, the list expanded to 11. That was about the time that she was assigned an attorney who wanted to prove her client was in fact insane to prevent her from being hanged. But again, Jane is adamant she is sane. Still, she wrote a confession letter to her lawyer, and in it, Jane detailed the murders of 31 patients that were in her care. 31! Her trial for the Davis family began in the summer of 1902. Prosecution reported that the Davises' deaths were originally financial, after the realization that Jane owed the family about $500 in rent. A guest within the house was a witness to Jane trying to get Maddie to dismiss her debt. Medical researchers settled on a combination of morphine and atropine as the poison used to murder the family, and police found a chemist in Falmouth who swore he sold morphine to Jane before the deaths. At trial, as part of the defense, Jane decided to take the stand in order to prove her sanity. Her lawyer believed that it would prove the opposite and basically allowed her to take the stand, in which Jane could explain the exact milligram dosages that she gave to the people and how she killed them. At one point stating, quote, "It is my ambition to have killed the most helpless people in the world," end quote. In the end, the jury found her not guilty by reason of insanity, of course. And after the trial, a man named William Randolph Hearst, a millionaire who owned multiple newspapers, managed to bribe people within the court system, receiving Jane's confession. Her whole confession, the one to her lawyer, the one that put the 2 hospitals that she worked for in a negative light, and people poured out wanting to know who the victims were, while other families said they wouldn't want to have their loved ones named and attached to Jane. There was a huge outcry as a result of this, and so in the background, as a result of all this information, a new deal was made. The prosecution would not continue to go after Jane for the additional murders beyond the 11 people confessed. In return, the defense was not allowed to appeal the insanity ruling. And with that, Jane was sent to the State Lunatic Hospital at Taunton in 1904. There she was diagnosed with, quote, "moral insanity," end quote, but today would be classified more as just a psychopath. At the time, she was pronounced the most prolific mass murderer of her time, and a regular source of study by medical and criminal experts. Admitting her decreasing memory, she later claimed her death toll could have reached 100, but she forgot many of the details, and so she just didn't put them in her confession. The first 4 weeks that she did arrive at the hospital, she wouldn't eat, claiming she was afraid her food would be poisoned for what she had done. But after dropping from 180 pounds to 160, she started eating again. And she lived there until August 18th, 1938, when she passed away at approximately 84 years old. Reports state that even in her older age, she would whisper to the nursing staff, quote, "Go and get some morphine, dearie. We can go out on the ward and have some real fun watching them all die," end quote. And that is the case of Jane Toppan, one of the most prolific serial killers who happened to be a nurse. All those out there listening, be careful. It's a dangerous world we live in.